Welcome to this special edition of The Sport of Bowling Show. On this episode, we feature USBC Deputy Executive Director Jason Overstreet, former USBC President and Chairman of the Equipment Specifications Committee, Andrew Cain. And now, it's time for The Sport of Bowling Show.
Hi again, everyone, and welcome to this special edition of the Sport of Bowling Show. I'm Jason Overstreet, and those of you that love bowling technology are going to be in for a fun conversation today. With us today, we have five-time Team USA member, Eagle winner at the Open Championships, former USBC president, and now also a member of the USBC Hall of Fame. He is the chair of the Equipment Specs Committee at USBC, Andrew Cain. Let's welcome Andrew in from Phoenix, Arizona. Andrew, good to see you.
Hi, Jason. Great to see you too. Thanks for having me.
Well, I know there's a lot of interesting topics that we've got to cover today, but before we get into the nitty-gritty of equipment specifications, just what have you been up to of the last few months as you haven't been able to spend as much time on the lanes as you normally like to? How have things been for you out there in Arizona?
Things have been interesting. Well, as you probably know, Arizona's been pretty front and center with what's going on in the pandemic. And so life has been very interesting here. We are very fortunate here that we've been able to bowl. As of a couple of months ago, bowling centers slowly started to reopen with guidelines. And we have a significant number of chain centers here, which has made it a little bit easier to get consistent guidelines in place. And the state has been very cooperative. The municipalities have been very cooperative with getting bowling reopened and getting everybody back to business, which has been great. Personally, I finally threw my first ball last week. I was doing another show a couple months back with Frank Wilkinson and told him how excited I was to get back to bowling. And surprisingly, I think that was 2 months ago, maybe. So it's been a little while to get back on the lanes. But the first time I did it, my daughter was so excited to go bowl for the first time in her 7-year lifespan. And so that was just a great opportunity to go out and do it.
Well, Andrew, a lot of fans and people that followed your career know that you had success on the lanes at an early age. The 1999 Chuck Hall Star of Tomorrow for USBC. How did you get started in the sport, and why is it something that's stuck for you?
Wow, you're taking me back a long way. I got started when I was 6 years old, and I remember my dad took me, my father took me, my grandmother was, my dad's mother was one of the top female bowlers in the city of Phoenix, and I actually had a great uncle that bowled on the PBA tour prior to there being a tour. This was back in the early 50s. He was from the state of Wyoming, and of course, I didn't know that at the time. So definitely bowling ran in that side of the family, unbeknownst to me. I don't think my dad ever averaged over 160. So at the time, I thought I was a bit of an anomaly in the family that I was a pretty good bowler. And then as far as becoming competitive, of course, 6, 7, 8, 9 years old, you don't really think too much about it. And he told me that as I started to get a little bit better, if I started to beat him, he'd quit. And so by the time I was 10, literally 10, I never forget this. That was the start of what I guess I would call my bowling career. And at that point, that's really all I ever wanted to do was throw a ball down the lane. I didn't know anything else existed beyond walking in on a Saturday morning, bowling my 3 games and getting some food and snacks and candy, and then going back and watching bowling in the afternoon on ABC, which was pretty awesome. Watching Mike Albee and all the lefties just hammer everybody every week. But governance, that started probably a little bit early. I got my taste of that when I was 15. I started in as a youth leader with YABA, and so that was probably my very, very first taste of that up until 2007. So I had a little bit of a gap in there, but that was probably my first taste of governance in the sport.
Also an accomplished collegiate bowler at Arizona State. So then, as you mentioned, got a little bit of a taste at the local level. When did you start to think that maybe this is something I wanted to be involved in at a higher level and get even deeper into in terms of the governance of the sport?
Well, Team USA certainly paved the way for that, because my first year on Team USA, 2001, it's been that long, huh? 19 years since I was first on Team USA. And of course, I'd been on the junior team 1 year prior to that, but my first year on the adult team, and I was pretty excited. And then I remember a letter I received in the mail. I believe it was in early 2007, notifying me that as a Team USA athlete in the last 10 years and having gone to a World Championships, that I was eligible to sit on the USBC board of directors to run for election. And of course, I had no idea what this was, but I thought this is pretty awesome to be able to have a voice. My wife and she looked at me and said, what is all this? What are you going to do? And I said, I don't know, but I think I should send it back. I'll talk to a few people, but boy, I've said this a lot of times in a lot of different interviews that we've done, but people always say, how do I get involved? And sometimes it's important that you remember, you just have to ask somebody. And that's really all it took, was that day that letter showed up, I was being asked to be involved in the governance of the sport. And I thought, how many people actually get an opportunity to do that, especially at that level? And so I sent the letter in. And the next thing I know, I was elected by the athletes to a spot, and here we are.
So over the years, you've had a chance to see up close all of the different things that USBC does, been involved in many different committees. What do you think is the most important thing? I know it's a big high-level question, but of all the different pieces, whether it's the rules, the equipment specs that you've been in, of course, the national team, can you pick to one that you really think is just central to what USBC is all about?
Well, I think, and of course, I'm going to be biased, and it's the topic of this conversation. I really do think at the heart, equipment specifications is probably one of the biggest, if not the biggest, roles that we play in this sport. And so it's obviously near and dear to me, because I've bowled and played at every level my entire life. I watch other people play the sport. I coach and try to help other people improve. And so I do a lot of different things that equipment specs touches. And so it definitely has a soft spot for me. At one point, it's a really hard question to answer. I tell you, they're all really close up to the top and equal. And I think that the biggest thing that I would say about all of them is it comes down to perspective. Everybody's got a little bit of a different focus. And the beauty about the breadth of governance that we have is that there is a little bit of something for everybody to take to heart and to be a part of, and to think is the most important. But as you said, the way they all work together as a whole, that is the most important thing. How harmonious everything is, to know that one part feeds the other, and that perspective is the most important.
Well, Andrew, you are the chair of the Equipment Specs Committee and have been for a few years. And for those that haven't read the manual, the Equipment Specifications Committee and the rules around equipment specifications for bowling cover a wide range of items. There's everything from pin setters to pins to, of course, the balls and anything that's involved in the competition. So there are a lot of things that the committee could focus its attention on. How have you, as chair, guided the committee in terms of what should be the priorities in terms of research and additional governance in your time?
Well, there's a number of different topics, and like we sometimes term it, we've pun intended, we've got a lot of balls in the air at all times. And throughout my years, I can think back to as far as the first time I was on the national board in 2007, when we were finishing up a section of the ball motion study. And if you go all the way back there, you'll even see, snippets of something like the oil absorption that we've become very heavily involved in pursuing the last few years. But as far as what are our priorities on the Equipment Specs Committee, first of all, we've got a lot of catching up to do. There's no doubt. And I think that's why we've tried to move very swiftly the last few years, because we need to make sure that in our role as the NGB, that we are very well established in terms of having our research in order, our methodology in order. And the last 5 years where we've really put an emphasis is on the process, because the most important thing we can do for a future generation for sustaining all of this is to have a process in place. So whatever the thing is that we're going to take in order, whether it's going to be changing the static weight changes of the bowling balls, or the oil absorption properties of the bowling balls, or the physical governance of the components of the lane, what we need to, or even the pins, whatever we do, we need to make sure that we are following a process and that we are documenting that as well as we can.
I think a big part of the reason that's so critical is because these changes do affect so many different stakeholders. And I think that's something that some lay people may not realize. Even if you think about the most recent elimination of the weight holes in bowling balls, that has an impact on manufacturers, has an impact on pro shops. And of course, it has an impact on the bowler. How do you take into account all of those varying interests that may have different impacts on all of these rule changes?
Well, the first thing you do is you take your time. This is never anything that is to be rushed into. You can never take one perspective or take one opinion, because we all wear different hats. Everybody that sits on the committee, even everybody on staff, everybody has a different hat and a different perspective and a different take. If we're proposing a new regulation regarding bowling balls, if I go bowl league or go bowl a tournament, I'm going to have 4 or 5 folks that have a specific opinion about how that affects them. And I consider that. I mean, I really do listen to what everybody has to say. It's very fascinating to hear everybody weigh in on whatever topic it is that might be up for consideration or change. And when a proprietor may not weigh in as much on a topic like that, they may not have a perspective. And again, some proprietors may not understand how those bowling ball changes could actually impact not only their business, but the effects of play in their center over a longer period of time. And so, matter of really being able to educate people on how all of these parts interact outside of their own sphere is really, really quite a challenging thing. And one that we have really focused on is trying to make sure that we have all of the stakeholder voices heard in the process and offered for comment where appropriate.
Getting that feedback from the field is really important. And I think continuing to reinforce that these decisions aren't being made in a vacuum by either the USBC president, the board, or certainly staff. Can you pull back the curtain a little bit on how that process looks like from the committee perspective, the research and data that you get from USBC staff, and also some of the experts that you can tap into to make sense of it all? Because in fairness, not everybody on the committee can be a technical expert in all of these different realms.
Right. So I'll back it up a little bit. Something you and I talked about a little while ago. Back in 2007, when I joined the national board, Jeff Boget was the president, and I thought, as an athlete representative, when he made a call for committees for the upcoming season, I said, well, hey, I'd love to be on the equipment specs committee. I'm a bowler. Isn't that the natural fit for me? Right. Just as if I were a lawyer, the legal committee would seem like a natural fit. And he told me no. And I thought, I have no identity on this board. Where am I going to sit as a bowler? I don't know much about any of this except for how to bowl. And, of course, I was perfectly willing to learn, but I knew nothing about that. How could you not put me in the one place I think I might be able to share some value? What I learned really quickly was that obviously there was a bigger strategy at play. And certainly by the next year, once we got to know each other a little better, he thought that I would be a good fit for that committee. But what that committee does is we operate, at the pleasure of the board. The board guides our larger strategic direction in terms of what we should be doing and how we should be prioritizing our initiatives. Really, the committee gets involved at a level that's a little bit deeper than that, where we help commission some of the research. We help decide and direct what types of topics and what types of research would need to be conducted in order to fully vet whatever particular issue we might be looking at. If it's something about ball static weights, then we work with the staff, and our staff's fantastic. And one of the things, pulling back the curtain, I do think there is a little bit of a perception that we've got an operation the size of the CDC, where we've got just millions of people and armies of people and dollars to go out and research, and we have all these fancy tools. And we don't have that. We have a limited pool of resources from which we pull, and we direct as much as we can to getting as much of this research completed as possible. So to your point about, who can we engage? We engage a lot of our partners to help us out with that. Kegel, for example, I'll just throw out one. They're experts in late maintenance technology. So if we have questions on practical matters, we certainly could reach out to our industry partners to help us shed some light on the things that we are looking at. As a regulatory body, of course, we have to be mindful of the neutrality and how we proceed with things. But certainly, we have an industry full of people that recognize the need for regulation in terms of equipment specs and the governance. And what we want to do is get a full picture. We are not out to, there's no intent to penalize anybody. There's no intent to create an unfair environment. Our goal simply is to go out and get the best information possible about whatever topic it is that we might be considering for change, figure out how impactful that is going to be to any parties, identify which parties in the industry might be affected, which stakeholders might be affected by that, which ones are less than obvious, try to vet out every single scenario. And boy, you've done a lot of work by the time you've even gotten to the research and testing phase. The first that starts with the question is, should we change it? Is there something to be changed? It's a little bit of you've got to ponder the greater mysteries of the universe in this sport before you decide whether something should be, run down or embarked upon. You can't just, hey, let's just go do it. We think we should make this change here. It sounds like a good idea and go. We don't do that at all. It's a very, very lengthy process. And I think, honestly, it's funny. It gets longer every time we do it. And that is an element of the transparency that we try to provide, because we add more and more elements to the process in every time to make sure that we are more and more thorough. And as we build that, we document it out. But we've got some wonderful partners, and we got great resources on the committee as well. We've got a technical advisor that is with us. Boy, how long has Scott been there? I don't even know. It predates me, back at least 20 years, most likely. And of course, we got a lot of great folks on the board and other people in the industry that participate on a regular basis. So we get a good cross section of people. We do our best to vet all of the research that is conducted, and at that point, then we make a decision on whether we're going to proceed with something or not.
You mentioned calls for change, and that's been sort of a great debate in the bowling world for many years, especially as it relates to things such as scoring escalation. What should change? How should it be addressed? Should the focus of the regulation change to be on the ball? Should it be on lane patterns? Should it be on the pins? As a committee, how do you land on and figure out, where to focus? Because pulling any of those levers can make an impact, or
absolutely,
all, but lots of complication in terms of which ones and how to move the needle.
Right. I think, and this is very much something that personally I believe, we've got to decide whether if there is a call for change, which is again one of our responsibilities. If there is a call for change from the field, and we believe that there is something that should be investigated and researched, that there might be more. It's like having a cold. You really need to decide whether the concern is a symptom, or if we've gotten down to the root cause of whatever it might be that seems to be out of alignment in the sport. And so at that point, what we have to do is vet out what the question is. And a lot of times it leads us to a much different place than we anticipated. A lot of times when you start digging into these various areas, you realize that some of them are interconnected. And the reason that both of them seem to be problematic is because there's actually a deeper cause. And once we get to that deeper cause, then the solution, if there is one, might not be quite as simplistic as it appears to one or two people that have identified what they believe is a problem.
The future of lane certification is something that's going to be changing, and I know that you've been a big part of that. And for those who may not be aware, I'll give some history. Historically, the process had been the local association comes out and inspects the lanes. If items are found out of specification, requests will be made to change those so that the lanes could be approved. In the future, the process is going to be that the lanes are measured by professional paid inspectors hired by USBC, and then centers will be placed into tiers of certification based on the results of those measurements. So a significantly different approach that's going to be coming in the future in a few years. Andrew, can you take us through, from the committee's perspective, how you got to that change being appropriate and one to push out?
Well, the first thing we did, a couple of things that we did. We started to have conversations about lane topography. Now, one of the hottest debates in competitive bowling circles are lane conditions. And again, lane conditions are overlaid on top of the playing surface. So we had already begun to take a look at the changes and the issues that we might be having with lane topography. And in the popular conversation, most of the information that you see out there provided by tournaments and discussion forums, but by anybody that might want to discuss it. You talk about bowling balls and what they do. People's the vernacular, the just the basic nature of the discussion always seems to revolve around what's very surface level. It's the lane conditions and how they change, but what's the underlying root cause of why some of these things happen, like I mentioned, and some of that started to point at lane topography. You can't change lane topography. I remember even hearing before I knew a lot about the topic many years ago. Well, wood lanes, as they get older, they're the problem. I'll tell you what, the research is out there. Wood lanes are actually flatter. So if the goal is flatness in terms of providing fairness in a playing environment, wood lanes are flatter. And the funny part is, and again, this predates me, I probably was 6 years old bowling on one of these lanes. And when synthetic panels were introduced, they were marketed and sold as something that would last the proprietor for years, didn't require a whole lot of maintenance, and they were perfect. They would never change. One of the things we found immediately as we were starting to do the research, and some of our industry partners had done research, is that those lanes are not perfectly flat, and they are different. And over time, they do change in very significant ways. When you start getting to 6-7 years on synthetic lane paddles, you actually start to see some more significant changes. And my guess is when people were seeing that, they weren't rationalizing it because, again, you were told that a lane surface was perfect. It was pristine and it would always be that way. But there was, of course, deformation in these lane surfaces that now we needed to go out and actually collect a lot of research and a lot of data to see how true this was and to see in what manner it was true. And then we could begin the discussion of, can we do something about this and how? That's a very difficult conversation because you've got a large investment by a number of privately owned businesses in these very playing surfaces. But we started to focus a little bit on how this was impacting our sport at large and whether this was going to create a problem. I know it's a buzzword, but sustainability. We finally had to really start looking at how sustainable was our sport going to be if we were not making significant changes to specifications, as we knew factually that technology was advancing, which it does everywhere.
Did you get an aha moment there, Andrew, when you were seeing that data on the committee? Because and realizing that, wait a minute, we have these specs that were created for wood, and you start seeing the data, and you can start seeing some flashing red lights.
Yeah, you start realizing that 100% of these centers are not. You're not going to get 100% of centers in specification. That really, the perfect environment was an imperfect environment, and I think we were starting, the general conversation, not just internally but externally, was how do we make all these lanes perfect? How do we make every single lane perfect from one to the next? And how do we apply that across a nation of bowling centers? I guess the short answer, you don't. And when you start to realize that you are in an imperfect world, it starts to become a little bit clearer and easier to realize that what you need to do is identify and categorize what might occur within those imperfect structures. And that's where some of the ideas, and by the way, tiered certification is not, that's not a new thing. Where we've ultimately landed with new specifications and with upcoming tiering, none of that is new. None of those concepts are new. If you go back and look at data, I'll tell you, just as far back as 2012, when I was on the board. I think this was right around the time that I was my first year as president. But we had a program on the table for professional lane inspection, and it was challenging. And I don't think that it was, at the time, it was a great idea or a bad idea. I think that we just didn't really have a way to facilitate it or handle it. We were on the right track. I don't believe in coincidence. One of the interesting things in all my years doing this now is that I've heard some of the same ideas more than once. And I don't think that an inaction by anybody in the past, part of USBC's promise is to celebrate the past, and we remember the past. We're mindful and respectful of who has come before us and what they've done. And I hear a lot of people unfairly malign people in the past, saying, gosh, why didn't they just do that when they knew about it? They're going to be saying that about us someday. But the reality is, you start to hear things 2 or 3 times, or you notice some commonalities, that might be where the answer is. But hey, we didn't have the technology to do it, or we didn't have the vehicle to do it. But now, if that still looks like it's the solution, and we have methodology that allows us to build a process to get there, it's something we should consider. And there is no coincidence there. That there's definitely there is something to it. But that's
we hear a common critique. You sort of mentioned this already a bit, but is that why don't these things go faster? Sort of that when there seems to be a consensus in the field that something needs to be done about an issue. Why does it take so long before an actual change in specifications gets out into the field and we start to see the impact?
Well, as some of what we've talked about, first of all, these issues start to build over time. One-offs and two-offs, those are not the types of things that immediately create a cause for specification change. If I learned anything in my years on the legal committee, and intimately involved with rules, we don't legislate exceptions. And I think a very similar principle, if not the exact principle, applies here. We don't take one concern and go out and try to create a rule change or a specification change to accommodate a single scenario. First, we have to decide if it is an isolated scenario. Secondly, we have to decide what the scope of impact could be. And like I said before, who does it impact? Because a minor impact to one stakeholder group might be a major impact to another. So first thing we have to do, if we've identified a problem, not only does the committee have to vet out what we intend to do to pursue, but then we also, again, we act on behalf of the USBC Board of Directors in terms of executing their mission and vision goals. We have to decide whether this fits into the larger strategic priority of the organization. And once we've obtained that blessing, again, so now you're talking, it could be a couple of months. There's a lot of work that just goes into that first stage. And I'm not walking you through any one practical example, but a couple of months here, a couple of months there. Actually, the research phase could take as long as a year, maybe 2, depending on what we actually find. Sometimes we find a data that's consistent. Sometimes the data leads us to another series of questions. And so the answer is, you just don't know. Very rarely do we do anything quickly because there's always more. And it would be fine if I want to go out and make a decision, or you want to go make a decision for yourself and test it. You don't really always have to do that kind of research. If you want to go out and, you go to the grocery store and there's 4 different varieties of peanut butter. If you pick the wrong one, you can go back and buy another. It's really quite simple. It's not as much of a dilemma to vet this out on, whether your family likes creamy or chunky, I don't know. But you want to buy a car, that's a different conversation. You want to buy a house, it takes a lot more time. We are literally talking about rules and specifications that impact entire industries and very, very large segments of business and volunteers and people that, membership, people that play. That's probably the largest one, and singularly the most important is people that play the game. Because the only thing I know is we do everything we do to ensure that not only people are going to keep playing the game, a fair and equitable environment to do it in. And that weighs very heavily. I would challenge anybody that might think it's simple to, take the issue that you might have brewing and lay down at night and think about how making the wrong choice could negatively impact a whole lot of people. Go look at what's going on, and with all the decisions and without getting any politics into this, but I want my daughter to go to school. We've got a whole host of issues. There are so many things that seem so simple, and in that case, unfortunately, they don't have the luxury of time. But boy, you sure can't make one decision without knowing how many other people it's going to impact and what way. So I think that it's a virtue that we are patient enough to take our time to be conscious of our responsibility. And I would hope that anybody that's in governance, or anybody watching what happens in governments, that you would want people that take their time to vet it all out. And ultimately, sometimes we do have to make the hard decision. and it's never the popular one. We can't make everyone happy, but we have an obligation to do what's right for the sport, and that cannot be done quickly.
Disruptive change can be good for some. It can be a struggle for others. And certainly
Sure.
I think that as we shift from talking a little bit about centers and the playing surface, if you will, to balls, and I think that some of the data that the committee saw related to the surfaces led to thinking more about balls in different ways, specifically as it relates to oil absorption and perhaps hardness to some degree. Can you talk a little bit about that? And just, that's been some real significant groundbreaking and I'd say disruptive changes that have happened with the ball regulations.
Yeah, very much so. We've had a number of changes over the years to static weights, and not to minimize or trivialize. This is just for ease of explanation. We've made a lot of changes to the differential and the RGs and the physical properties of the bowling ball over the years. And some you could look back and say, wow, that was a quick fix, that didn't really work. And some, why did you ever do it? We should go back to the way we were doing it before. The advent of the reactive bowling ball in the 90s was such a game changer for this space, because it was such an advanced form of technology that I think largely took everybody off guard. And so it was something that was just nobody expected it. Nobody was really prepared for it, and it has made for a very challenging couple of decades. Yeah, you look at it, and nobody would ever say that wasn't one of the finest advancements, to be able to to help people create hook, which is one of the things that you want to be able to do as a bowler if you're going to score higher and get better and be more competitive, is to learn how to hook the ball. It doesn't take any of the other elements of the game specifically out of play. It creates more of a challenge, but it allows people to learn different aspects of physical and mental game and how to play. It's really kind of a cool thing. But if you go back and you take a look at where all of that started to come from, in 2007, again, when we completed the ball motion study, oil absorption was one of the top factors that was affecting bowling balls and affecting what happened as a ball went down the lane, the rate of oil absorption of a ball. There was no specification. This was a unique challenge in and of itself, only because we were not modifying an existing specification. We didn't have a lot of history to fall back on, or what did prior generations do to address this, or now that we have new technology, how do we look at what we were doing and modify it? We were in foreign territory, so we really had to, our team had to go out and decide, if we're going to measure it, that's the first thing you look at is this measurable? Is this something that we can do? 25 years ago, probably not. A lot of imperfect tests. People might remember I know Chad talks about this a lot, the oil finger test when you're measuring oil absorption. You put a little bit of oil on the ball and you smear your finger around and you measure how long it takes. A lot of things that ignores. It's not a bad study. It's not scientifically perfect by any means or precise, but what it does do is it gives you an idea of where to start. How are we going to measure oil absorption, and how much impact would a specification change in this area create? A lot of people said, hey, this isn't going to do anything immediately. It's really just going to affect manufacturers. But in the long term, what is this going to do for us? And again, that's the process we followed. Is this something we can measure? Is it a test that we can create? Is it a test people can repeat when they're producing these bowling balls? And is this something that will have a long-term impact that is good for the stakeholders involved in terms of creating sustainability in our sport? And when we started to check all those boxes, then we started to move forward.
So you mentioned that oil absorption has been on the radar of the committee for quite a while as something that's central to ball performance in some way. And so then as time evolved and a reasonable process to measure it became available, that's what led to the spec that actually just became in force, in effect, August 1st. Can you just take me through why the committee thinks this could be a game changer over the long term? Because I know that this is one of the more significant changes in terms of regulation that USBC has put forward for balls in quite some time.
Sure. As you know, there's a lower limit on this specification, and so what we were noticing was a trend towards bowling balls that were being manufactured with decreasing times of oil absorption. Basically, the time that a drop of oil was placed on a bowling ball was decreasing, and that oil was being absorbed into the cover stock. So a number of different things come into play there. Overall, people feel, again, popular opinion is that this is an attempt to control scoring. The scoring doesn't have anything to do with this. This has to do with the sustainability of the product and the environment. If you look at the trends of oil being applied to a lane, and this is a very cliched statement, but it's true. It is a true statement. We're running out of lane. More and more oil being placed on a lane. We're running out of lane in the most literal sense. And so we've got to find a way to put controls in place that will minimize and mitigate how much of that can be used up, at any given time. We don't want to have massive, to use your word, disruptive change in a playing environment that creates potentially unfair situations. And as a player, I completely embrace the fact that a changing environment is part of the game. The question is, at what limit do we believe that environmental change is no longer a part of the game, but it becomes a detracting factor in the game? And those are some of the more philosophical questions. You have to then assign physical limits to where is that point in time, or what is that number? What is look, how many ounces, is it, you've heard this argument before with side weight in the balance holes, 2, 3, 4. We've all seen the video where over 4 ounces, the ball goes backwards. It starts hooking, and then it enters a fourth phase of motion and goes the other way. Okay, so we know it's less than 4 and greater than 2. And boy, people come to a lot of conclusions, but we try to measure that. And we try to find where, statistically, again, we have an expert, a person that is an absolute expert in these statistics in the automotive industry. And in the automotive industry, you're talking about analyzing statistics of this magnitude, and it's life or death. Fortunately, this is bowling. We're not talking about life and death, but we are talking about something that is incredibly impactful across the entire scope of the sport. So we've got to identify, we have to do a little better than guess. We have to do a lot better than guess. We have to hone down research, iteration after iteration, to find out, can we measure this? And if we do, and we choose to put a rule in, can we repeatedly enforce that rule?
If there's one thing we can count on when it comes to equipment specs, I think, Andrew, we've seen this, it's that stakeholders are going to innovate. Whether you're a manufacturer, you're a bowler, a proprietor, there's going to be innovation and looking at the specifications from different perspectives or trying to do things different. And sometimes that can lead to old conversations becoming new conversations again. Ball hardness suddenly became a huge issue, certainly at the higher end playing environment this year, with some more testing being done by USBC and some research being published. I'm sure that was an interesting thing for you to help guide the committee through. Any specific learnings or things that stood out from you through all that happened with that new research and what we found in those field tests?
That was such a unique issue, because usually what we're doing is we're looking at, and again, I think it's unfair to ever categorize anybody that's in our positions as, those who want to stifle innovation, or we want to stifle the way the game is played. I think we all believe firmly that the game, especially as a player, I think the game is beautiful. I think the different variations of what goes on, and how the players on tour create what they do physically and mentally, and how they adapt and create things in the game that make it very unique for them. How ball manufacturers innovate their products and what they do, and how lane oil is adapted, how the surfaces change. I mean, there's just, gosh, I can't even tell you how awesome it is. There's always going to be that's the beauty of humanity, right? It's innovation. And so there's never any attempt to stop innovation. Really, all our role is in governance is trying to, manage the rate of innovation, because people that create, their responsibility and what they're good at is creating. It's not necessarily to identify every issue, because if people that were creating things out of nothing were to bother to stop, I mean, God, I don't want to sound like somebody that goes back 50, 60 years. But if they stopped and thought about all of the ramifications of what they were going to create, it would stifle their creative process. We don't want to stifle anyone's creativity. We want people to create and innovate. What we just need to do is identify where and when those creations and those innovations are going to possibly create impacts in the game that could be negative to the game's future. And so in terms of ball hardness, it was just so unique, because now we're going back to a specification that dates back into the 70s, something that's very old. There were tests that were done back then. I guarantee you the way we were testing it 3 months ago, more than 3 months ago now, 6 months ago, was certainly not the way they were testing it in the 1970s. The hardness gauges, those durometers have been around forever. Those have not changed significantly to my knowledge. Perhaps the tolerances have, as they've gotten better at dialing in the way they construct the instruments. But hardness is hardness. The balls that we were talking about in terms of the study, the urethane balls, that's not new technology. We were looking and revisiting something that it was an interesting anomaly. But really, the interesting part is, who was it impacting the most? Reactive balls, I mentioned this earlier, they still hook more. And so at your local league level, what is the advantage of somebody with a slightly softer urethane ball? And we got a lot of criticism about, hey, at least enforce the hardness, at least enforce your rules. And so we endeavored to create some field testing. We had to go out and get the data. Let's see what's actually happening. There was a strong belief that came out of the field that there was an issue with ball hardness all of a sudden. Baffling how you get back to something that's that old, but it has happened. And so we needed to decide how and if we were going to deal with it, if there was a way to deal with it, if there was a way to measure what was going on. And we did institute a field test, and then we ended up realizing that that was not a repeatable thing. And then we made some responsible decisions, ultimately landed on moving the specification up slightly to 73, and it seems like it's not a very big impact, but we followed the data. Big mantra that we talk about internally all the time is following the data. Now, for everybody out there that might be listening that says, well, hey, anybody can interpret the data. Yes, but first of all, you have to have data. We had to go out and collect data, especially in the environments where there seemed to be the biggest cause for concern. And it was a challenge. I'll tell you what, I think creating oil absorption specifications might have arguably been easier than going back and trying to unpack 40 or 50 years of something that simply had been.
Well, it feels like for the committee too, sometimes you're dealing with these issues that may be a major issue within one community of the sport. So in this example, it was really the highest and the elite players, whereas it wasn't necessarily a major issue for the casual league bowler. Whereas in the oil absorption issue, it's really the other way. It's to where it's a broad issue for the way the environment changes across the board. And I know that's something that sometimes the committee has to spend a lot of time on, because it's tough when these things may have completely different impacts for those different stakeholder groups, depending on where you are on the competitive continuum.
Right. And I think that you take the largest stakeholder group that we have in terms of number, and that's our membership. Those are the people that play the game, that sign up every year and become USBC members. And you take the one thing that is personal to them, that's theirs, that they have in front of them all the time, in their bowling balls. So naturally, I think there's always going to be a nexus of the most obvious thing to me is the thing that I own. I don't own the lane. I don't take pins home with me. I buy a bowling ball and I take the bowling ball home with me. That's my bowling ball. And you get a lot, all of the marketing that goes along with this process. It's a very natural
thing. And if
thing.
you ask any bowler to talk about their favorite ball, or the ball that they had as a kid, or that ball that they got for Christmas one year, it is really personal. Yeah.
Very rarely do people say, hey, what was your favorite lane in that bowling center that you bowled on?
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't remember what lane I bowled on. I mean, yeah, I remember. I mean, I have to admit, it's part of that was, the professional bowler. It's part of your job. But the average person, I don't remember what lane I bowled on last week. And it's such a different conversation. But they know every single bowling ball they've had, and they knew how much that ball hooked and exactly what that ball did. So it's really not that, oh, everybody's bowling balls are being picked on, or you're making bowling balls a part of the conversation, and they're not. They're just the most obvious one. It's the most visible piece that everybody can talk about, because everybody that's a stakeholder that sees us, they're impacted by it. They all see it. It's front and center every single time. The ball conversations sometimes, frankly, are some of the things are so incredibly minimal if you look at the whole in terms of impact. But the funniest thing is, it's the hottest button in the conversation every single time. If you really sat here and looked at lane topography like we do, and boy, if everybody understood it the way we have come to know it, you might feel a little differently. But again, I take the bowling ball home with me. It's my bowling ball. It's really interesting. You think about your car, right? You take your car home. I don't know what tire manufacturer. I mean, the intricacies of the type of engine. It's, and I'm a car nerd, so of course I know a little bit more about that than most. But I bore my wife to death. She can care less with that conversation. But you talk about where you source parts for a vehicle, and I'm sure in the automotive world, I know for a fact after talking with Scott, that's a very big conversation. But it's not a public one, because the public's just you expect it to work. When I walk into a bowling center, I expect the pins to be there. I expect the lanes to be regulation. I expect the lanes to be oiled. And I want my food hot, and I want my bathrooms clean. And but my bowling ball is my own.
So to that end, Andrew, you're, as being a PBA player and a manager of one of the PBA league teams, everybody on tour knows you. Probably everybody has your phone number. So whenever, as the committee chair of Equipment Specs Committee, you make a change that impacts this, do you ever kind of think when you walk into the center, maybe it's like, okay, I better not let anybody see I'm here, or do you get much grief?
Well, the comical part about that is most people just want to know how do I get a hold of Chad?
They've all got his number too. So
they've all got Chad's number, right. They've all got my number. I say, well, hey, I'd be happy to answer your question. Anybody that's ever asked any questions, I've never shied away from having that conversation. And do we always make 100% the right decision? Of course not. Do we endeavor to? 1,000% of the time. We try to make all of our decisions based on the facts that we can find, and then we proceed responsibly. I'm never not going to have a conversation, sorry for the double negative, but I'm never going to shy away from a conversation with someone about a specification that we helped create or change, because their opinion is completely relevant. End of the day, that might be the person that we didn't make very happy, that it was more impactful for them than someone else, but that is part of our responsibility. And as far as tour goes, yeah, I've had some of those really uncomfortable conversations. And the funniest part, some of the guys I watched growing up, you'll see some stuff that they said, hey, they've been batting that around. They've been batting. I'm going to be part of that they at some point in the future, but they were batting that around for 40 years and never changed it. I always thought it should be changed. Glad you guys finally did it. There's always that. That we have a very difficult job that we volunteer for. We certainly don't do it for the platitudes and for the thanks. We do it because it's the responsible thing to do, and because we believe that we have a stake in this as much as anybody, and we want to see things be successful. It does not mean we're always going to make everyone happy. I'm very appreciative when I see that. It's great. People that have been around the sport 40, 50 years that see some of these changes and tell me, hey, they should have done that back then. That's kind of a nice thing to hear, and maybe some of it's true, and it's certainly an opinion, but yeah, everybody looks at it a little bit differently, and I've heard it both ways. I've gotten the spectrum of of criticisms and adulation, Jason. I've gotten both sides of that.
I can imagine. Well, Andrew, as chair of this committee, I know that you're always looking to try to see the big picture and see what may be ahead. So where do you see the focus of the USBC Equipment Specs Committee in the future?
We've batted a whole lot around. Obviously, the tiered certification system that's coming, that that is going to be, I think, a very big game changer in a lot of ways. It's really tough to say exactly where this is going to go. I certainly don't know how much longer I'm going to be involved with it. I don't know how much time anyone else is going to be involved, and where those priorities might be driven. Again, I am mostly fixated on making sure that we've caught up enough to the technology that is currently available, that we understand it well enough. And I think that some of the direction starts to resolve itself from there. I know that's a really vague answer, and that doesn't specifically answer what you're asking about. Like, where do you guys want to go next? I don't have a very specific thing. There will be some interesting conversations, I think, coming far down the road about, pin setters are an interesting thing with the COVID pandemic. It's really interesting to see what's going to happen with businesses. So that has thrown a bit of a wrench into what comes next, because some of it will depend on how a lot of our stakeholders come out on the other side of the country reopening. It's really very sad to see so many bowling centers closing, and some that will not reopen after decades of service, and bowlers that in those towns that may never get the opportunity to bowl reasonably again, or for years until they can get a new bowling center. So I don't know. I don't want to say our future's on hold. That's why we continually move on these initiatives. But lately, as you've seen, we've moved the dates back for a lot of things. We've relaxed the dry towel rule to accommodate alcohol, to make sure that we are in tune with safety guidelines as prescribed. And we just keep adjusting. Right now, we're in a bit of a holding pattern until we know exactly what the environment's going to look like. Our specifications, that we could still do research, but what we do doesn't matter a whole lot if there aren't any places to play. And so our focus is on supporting everybody that needs to get back out of the lanes and make sure they do. But lane certification, that's certainly going to be the hot topic in the coming years. Like I said, balls, not to trivialize it, the ball conversations come and go. There's constant innovation in the ball space. We know we don't talk about pins. There's some conversations, I think, that need to be had involving pins as well. It's just not the pins are not the sexiest topic. They're not the hot topic because people don't think about the defense in our sport quite so much. It's not as hey, they're 60 feet away, right? Practically speaking, but how we are able to continue to approach, and what the evolution of the lane inspection and certification space looks like, because that is the physical playing environment. That is going to guide what happens next.
Well, Andrew, I appreciate your insight. And as we close out, I just really want to thank you for your service to USBC, and thank you for your dedication to the Team USA program as well. And I know I'm really looking forward to being there to see your induction into the USBC Hall of Fame. Well deserved.
Yeah, no, I was looking forward to it this year. Certainly, it will be no less sweeter next year, but I look forward to it as well. And it's really been a pleasure to this point, serving in my role and serving USBC and bowling in all the ways that I've been able. And it's going to be a very, very emotional look back. I still continue to be very excited about what I do, and think it's a lot of fun. And all of the great people we work with, that's really what drives it. That's what makes us do what we want to do. And I love it. I've had a great time. And hopefully, down the road, what we've done is impactful in a way that is very positive for our sport.
Absolutely. Andrew, thanks again for the insight today. Andrew Cain, former USBC president and current chair of the USBC Equipment Specifications Committee. See you soon, Andrew. Well, thanks again for everyone for joining us for this special edition of the Sport of Bowling Show. I'm Jason Overstreet, and we'll look forward to seeing you again on another episode.